of the Climate Heritage Network for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the focal point of agriculture and food access in this network. I will be guiding this event with such great panelists, whom I thank for being here today, as well as to you all who are following the current session. I want also to highlight the great work done bringing culture to the global discussion table on climate change, both from the Climate Heritage Network, from PRAXIS, and from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Well, this is a bilingual session, Spanish-English. For this reason, at the bottom of your screen, you can choose the language of your preference to attend this session. Certainly, arts, culture, heritage, climate change, food, and agriculture are integral to addressing the urgent need for developing resilient food and agricultural systems, particularly in the context of climate change. However, they have been largely underestimated in favor of infrastructural, high-tech, and top-down agricultural investments to address immediate food and health security needs, which are often implemented in similar ways around the world without respect for the specific of different contexts. Well, this session will draw on real-world examples from across the globe to explore ways that arts, culture, and heritage can address issues of food and agricultural sustainability and resilience, while also considering the needs of marginalized groups and transforming social inequalities. Thus, the session will focus on raising awareness and increased understanding of the important role of arts and culture and intangible heritage practices in food and agricultural resilience in the context of climate change. Highlight ways in which arts, culture, and heritage intersect with issues around food and agricultural resilience. Acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of knowledge systems, languages, livelihoods, functions, worldviews, and belief systems in supporting food and agricultural resilience, and provide concrete examples of successful experiences. Explore the ways in which marginalized groups are at greater risk on food insecurity and agricultural shocks brought on by climate change. Explore and illustrate opportunities for addressing social inequalities in the area of food and agriculture through heritage and arts-based methods. The permanence of safeguarding of cultural expressions corresponding to food and agricultural heritage is linked to several factors, such as inheritance, memory, validity, and representativeness, as well as the problem of climate change. The current climate crisis generated by humans has negative effects on agricultural production and livelihoods of farmers, foresters, and fisherfolk. Agriculture sectors contribute to climate change due to their emissions of greenhouse gases, and at the same time are threatened by many factors, such as changes in patterns of precipitations, increase of temperatures, and the competition for natural resources. They are also dealing with migration due to low economic viability, which has resulted in traditional farming practices being abandoned and endemic species and breeds being lost. It will also have significant impact over food security and sovereignty. Agriculture and food are closely tied to culture, heritage, and livelihood, and at the same time to nature cycles, seasonality, local consumption, and traditional cooking. Thus, arts, culture, and heritage have an enormous power to inspire actions aimed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and strengthening resilience to climate change. In this context, the following video that we are going to present collects 3 short narratives from the community about what the problem of climate change represents culturally to them and its impact on agricultural and food expressions. First, we are going to hear the testimony of Monica Maruri about how millenary cooking techniques are expressions of hospitality and beliefs that symbolize the cultural roots shared by the communities and reinforce their sense of belonging. Monica Maruri is the Executive Director of the Natural and Cultural Heritage Institute of the Organization of the Andrés Bello Agreement. She is a journalist with a master's degree in new technologies for education. She has been director and producer of cultural and educational audiovisual content for adults and children since the 1980s. Then Sofia Fonseca will hold a very passionate presentation about codfish and the identity symbol of Portugal gastronomy and its concerns of the consequences of global warming in the consumption of codfish and its impact on Portugal cultural heritage. Sofia Fonseca is an archaeologist specialized in Egyptology and cultural heritage. She is member of the International Committee of Cultural Tourism of ICOMOS, the Community for the Integration of the Management of Archaeological Heritage and Tourism of the European Association of Archaeology, and the Climate Heritage Network, where she works on how traditional food systems can be part of the fight against food waste. Sofia is the founder of Teiduma, a consultancy on heritage and culture, and the coordinator of the platform of an online podcast on African archaeology and heritage. Finally, we will listen to Pablo Ortiz, an agricultural engineer from the University of La Habana, Cuba. He has dedicated 15 years of his life to urban agriculture, and he is currently the owner of the restaurant Vivero Sabroso, an interesting project on how to do things better in relation to the environment and how to influence on climate change. Let's see the video.
In Ecuador, generations had baked fanescas, a soup with 12 different grains, or colada morada, a purple flower drink with fruits, soups from the Amazon through the highlands all the way to the coast, exploring baking traditions graven in many family generations. Each family has a particular recipe, a secret ingredient, especially a particular ritual. It's people who see the value in this legacy, the connection of family coming together. It's part of their identity, our identity, a way of strengthening family ties or within the same community. These are living expressions of our most ancient past. Our first memories are related to food and family rituals. Our pride is tied to these inherited memories, because they make us celebrate certain moments of life through meals that bring people around the table to enjoy the art of eating and drinking, symbol of generosity and hospitality when served to guests. The fanesca is a grain soup prepared only in the Holy Week. Each family has a special ingredient shared with friends and the whole community with great pride and kindness. These memories are treasured as a valuable intangible heritage, but also in the sensory memory of every Ecuadorian. In the past, these dishes could only be found at family homes, but now they're also found in restaurants. The colada morada, or purple flower drink with fruits, is only served with guaguas de pan, or bread babies, in the Day of the Dead. Family used to take it to the graveyard and share together. Recipes are a little different in the highlands and in the coast. There's a lot of pride in these special preparations and a sense of belonging also tied to the social gathering and the family chat. These dishes are not only the result of a combination of gastronomies from America and Europe, but the product of religious syncretism, making the stew coincide with Holy Week, or the purple drink used to represent the morning of the celebration of the Day of the Dead. Baking has always played an important role in local and regional economies. The ingredients of these traditional plates are local and millenary. The first inhabitants of South America used the same ingredients and similar cooking techniques. These are expressions of hospitality, solidarity, and certain beliefs that symbolize the cultural roots shared by the communities and reinforce the sense of belonging of the members to them.
O bacalhau, ou como os portugueses gostamos de chamar, o fiel amigo, assim chamado desde o século XIX, é sem lugar a dúvida o grande símbolo da identidade nacional portuguesa, como afirma Álvaro Garrido, tendo até ganho atributos de herança cultural. Onde há um português pelo mundo fora, há bacalhau à mesa, com certeza. Esta relação data do século XIV, onde os primeiros registros da presença de bacalhau em Portugal são referidos. Mas é a partir do século XVI que, de facto, essa relação e esse consumo aumentam e os laços se estreitam. Um bocadinho relacionado com a expansão marítima. Ao ser consumido como um peixe seco, podia ir por esses mares afora, nas naus, chegando a vários pontos do mundo, entre eles o Brasil, onde ainda hoje é muito apreciado. Mas é muito curioso como um peixe que não é um peixe dos nossos mares, vem do Mar do Norte, da Groenlândia e da Terra Nova, se transforma neste símbolo identitário e nesta paixão gastronómica que os portugueses temos, porque desde o século XVIII afirmamos que temos 1000 maneiras de fazer bacalhau. Também está presente noutras zonas do Mediterrâneo, como a Grécia, a Itália e a vizinha Espanha, mas em nenhum lado, como em Portugal, adquire esta simbologia profunda. Não só para nós portugueses, mas mesmo para os estrangeiros que, quando vêm a Portugal, não deixam de provar um prato de bacalhau. O que é certo é que este peixe do Mar do Norte é também o rei das nossas mesas na noite mais importante do ano, a consoada, a noite de Natal, quando as famílias se unem para celebrar o Natal. É aí que, nas nossas mesas, ganha o bacalhau o prato de rei e isto deve-se em parte a questões religiosas, porque por motivos religiosos não se comia carne na noite de Natal, mas também porque de facto é a grande paixão da nossa gastronomia. Não passamos sem ele. Aqui se levanta então uma grande questão. Com o aquecimento global que estamos a viver e a sobreexplotação dos bancos do peixe do Mar do Norte, o que será de nós? Os maiores consumidores de bacalhau do mundo, com mais de 20% do consumo mundial, quando o nosso fiel amigo desaparecer.
El cambio climático es una cosa que ya no es una cosa académica, ya no es una cosa, digamos, de texto, ya no es una cosa de foro, es una cosa que la tienes tú cotidianamente en tu casa, en tu espacio de vivienda, ¿o cierto? Por algún lado te afecta, ¿o cierto? Por algún lado, digamos, nos va a llegar, entonces es importante que sepamos cómo cambiarlo. Entonces la forma de cambiar es, tal vez es tu alimentación, tu forma de consumo. Creo que comer es cultura. O sea, sentarte en una mesa con 4 personas, 4 brazos, un plato, buena música, creo que, digamos, hace cultura. Cuando comes tienes una gran decisión, ¿o cierto? Tú, digamos, adquieres un producto y eso significa que eso tiene un efecto en el mercado. O sea, si tú consumes productos, digamos, directamente del campo, eso va a ayudar. Si tú consumes, digamos, en la tienda de esquina, en la verdulería, eso también va a ayudar. Si tú consumes en el mercado, eso también va a ayudar. Lo importante es que seas consciente que todo lo que comas tiene un efecto sobre la natura, sobre la relación campo-ciudad, sobre el tema de la seguridad alimentaria. Los huertos urbanos, digamos, son como la posibilidad esa de tener la salud en tu casa, ¿no? De tener productos, digamos, sanos en la casa que puedan, digamos, ayudarte a cambiar tu forma de vivir, que ahorita es súper importante, ¿no? Que los agrónomos o los campesinos solos no podemos, sino que tenemos que tener una relación con el otro lado, digamos, del comercio, que en este caso son los chefs, que son los cocineros, que son los restaurantes. Entonces, como Sabroso viene a juntar esas dos áreas, viene a juntar una experticia en el huerto urbano y, digamos, una experticia en la comida. digamos, esta relación chef-agrónomo, el agrónomo ofrece ese conocimiento al chef y el chef puede tener, digamos, una mayor conciencia el rato de decidir o hacer su menú. Sabroso Restaurante Vivero es un ejemplo pequeño de cómo hacer las cosas mejor en relación al ambiente, a la natura y cómo incidir en el cambio climático. Somos vegetarianos, nuestros desechos van a las lombrices, de las lombrices obtenemos el humus que va a la huerta y de la huerta obtenemos nuestros alimentos. Consumimos, digamos, de acuerdo a lo que existe en el mercado, ¿no es cierto?, a los productos de ciclo. Apoyamos espacios digamos, de resistencia y de patrimonio como el mercado, como, digamos, la tienda de la verdulería de la esquina. Entonces es importante entender que las pequeñas cosas, ¿cierto?, que tu comida, tu alimentación, genera un efecto en el cambio climático, genera positivo o negativo. Entonces creo que es importante como analizar qué está pasando en tu vida cotidiana, dónde estás, digamos, comprando tus productos, a quién estás apoyando, y creo que todos podemos lograr algo mejor para que esto, digamos, pueda mejorar.
Well, these three short but emotive narratives make us analyze the need and task of executing possible solutions to reduce the impact that climate change exerts on agriculture and food heritage. For example, traditional markets play a fundamental role in this connection, where initiatives to register and promote intangible heritage within the process of production and sale of food, as well as the rescue of old food structures that have been described as sustainable, must be rescued and disseminated as a priority to support the strategies to be implemented to face climate change. Since 1970, agri-industry has increased dramatically, based on the idea of producing enough food for the growing world community demands. Facing this main objective, feeding humankind, agri-industry did not take into account the effects on agrochemical and greenhouse gases that have generated a snowball that has not only favored environmental degradation, but also has degraded agricultural intangible heritage. Agri-industry has displaced farmers and native people, and consequently centuries-old traditional practices that were culturally and technologically in closeness with the environment have been eliminated. Therefore, the importance of recording and disseminating intangible memory of people as a strategy against climate change. And the present background takes us to the second part of this event, where we are going to introduce some case studies from different parts of the world on how arts, culture, and heritage may address issues on food and agricultural sustainability and resilience. Our first guest is Professor Nina Laurie, Geography and Development Professor at the University of St Andrews, Scotland. She studied at Newcastle University, UK, McGill University, Canada, and University College of London. These sites of learning have been important influences on her academic development, but she has perhaps learned most from others during experiences in activist academic settings. Her current research on El Niño and desert food systems has returned her to Peru, her first and most enduring love. The urgent need for hugely better inter-cross-disciplinary sector conversations and action on climate change have combined to take her back there in person and virtually in recent times. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you, Angelica, and thank you for the team who are organizing things for us. I think my PowerPoint will be shared now. My images will be shared by my colleague Francesca. Thank you, Francesca. So What I'm going to talk about in this short time, as Angelica suggested, is my first and most enduring love, which is Peru. And most recently, I've had the huge privilege of working with collaborators at universities and NGOs and in schools and grassroots communities in the northern part of Peru. And what we want to share with you today, collectively, is an experience of trying to think through the way in which El Niño has been managed in the desert regions of northern Peru over 2,000 years. And yet these are not the stories about El Niño that we usually hear about. So that's a sort of recovery story that we're going to be sharing. Now, if you're thinking, what on earth is El Niño? It is cyclical rains that have been in the archaeological record in northern Peru for about 2,000 years. And what happens is usually the desert part of northern Peru is in the rain shadow, because most rains come across the Amazon, fall on the Andes, and then there's a rain shadow along the coast, hence the desert. And this goes all the way down South America, down to the Atacama Desert. However, at certain times, sea temperatures, or the surface temperatures in the Pacific, rise, and this causes rains to come on a cyclical basis, 5-7 years or so, usually over the last millennia, 2 millennia, from the Pacific. So they basically inundate the coast. So the story, therefore, about El Niño is largely a story of disaster. Next slide, please. And if we ask ourselves, okay, well, what work, if you like, has the past, has history, has the stories about El Niño, what work has that done in terms of understanding El Niño? Well, what it's tended to do, it's tended to be mobilized as a sort of a warning about what's coming next. So in this newspaper article here from 2016, you can see a focus straight away on infrastructure. So the mass destruction of that's a bridge that was destroyed by the flooding of the river Piura. And that picture was drawn from the El Niño of 1997-98, and is trying to make people aware of the forthcoming El Niño and get them prepared that they were expecting in 2016. However, this never actually arrived. So this sort of auguring, if you like, of the future using the past can be quite a dangerous thing to do, particularly if people don't believe it. And what happened in 2017 was a very large unexpected El Niño arrived. And there was devastation in just within the first month. So it arrived in March 2017. There were 97 deaths just in the first month, 184,000 people displaced, and 30,000 homes were destroyed. And particularly the city, the northern city of Piura, was affected. And reconstruction, which I'll come back to at the end, has focused particularly on the large infrastructure projects to help protect El Niño affected areas in the north of Peru in the future. Next slide, please. So what we have done as this interdisciplinary research project is we've looked at a number of different types of sources of information, one of which has been archives. And you can see here a number of newspaper archives that our partner organisation SIPCA hosts in northern Peru. And these are newspaper archives dating back well into the 1980s. So we did an analysis of more than 6,000 newspaper articles from looking at the 83 El Niño and the 97-98 El Niño to try to work out what was the representation. Was this always talked about as a disaster? And indeed it was. There was hardly anything that didn't talk about El Niño as a disaster experience. And this also is true back to the colonial archives. We are working in partnership with the University of Piura in northern Peru, and this archive in the National Archive has been identified by one of our thesis students, Peruvian thesis students, Electa Correa, and she's working on this now. And this is a source from 1592 that talks about the El Niño rains as well. So then the dominant national story and all the development planning around disasters in Peru takes on board the fact that the country needs to prepare for El Niño events, because they always come around cyclically. Next slide, please. But what we want to focus on in our project, and what we are focusing on, are actually the untold stories from this part of northern Peru, and particularly the stories of the Sechura Desert, and the ways in which in this area for thousands of years, very marginal desert communities whose voices don't get heard have been managing El Nino, have been working with El Nino, have a whole set of memories that inform everyday practices now in order to manage the opportunity that El Nino brings to this very dry desert community. And we got to this point of a focus on this project because we were sampling cores from lake beds, so scientific paleoecological research. We were taking samples of the mud from the lake beds, the dried lake beds, to try to work out whether El Nino over the last 1,000 years has been getting more intense with climate change. And on that journey, we had a 4x4 car, and we basically gave a lift to the local mayor, who very sadly, Senor Pingo died earlier in 2021 from COVID. And Senor Pingo was in the car with me, and I was saying to him, you know what, we found all this stuff in the newspaper archives about the devastation of El Nino and what it does in northern Peru. It just must be really awful for you. And he took a deep breath and he turned around from the front seat, passenger seat, to the back. He said, Señorita, for us, it's not a disaster. It's abundancia. It's abundance. So my ears pricked up. And so this is now the story that we're just going to share with you. This story of how these marginal desert communities have dealt with this opportunistic rain that comes every 7 years or so. And this isn't to decry that disasters also happen, okay, but it's to try to put the other part of the story. Next slide, please. Now, to see this visually, these are satellite images from the Sentinel-2 satellite, so they're taken way above the Earth, and you can see it's from January 2017, March 2017, and April 2017. So you've got the bit to the left is the Sechura Bay, so that's the sea, and the long black line is the Pan American Highway. And you can see in January, before the El Nino of March, it's basically a dry desert. There's a very small lagoon, Nampique, but otherwise you're just looking at desert. And within the space of 2 months, you're looking at very, very large lagoons. And even 2 years later, you can see that those large lagoons are still there. Now, these have become a source of livelihoods for marginal people every time that the El Nino rains come. And the lagoons also get fed by the rain that comes down through the River Piura when it also hits the mountains. So whatever the scenario for El Nino with climate change, and the sort of argument seems to be it's getting more intense and heavier and less predictable. Whatever the scenario, however, these lagoons are going to carry on appearing in the desert, and also they're going to carry on getting filled up in the rainy season, because predictions for climate change in northern Peru are saying that rains in the north will become heavier. So more rain is going to fall in the mountains in northern Peru, and therefore more rain will come down, down through the river. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? It basically looks like in places that otherwise don't grow corn, suddenly corn can appear. And our oral histories with our community members basically said things, we're happy when it rains. One farmer who was 78 said, when it rains, the soil remains damp. We can plant crops like corn, watermelon, beans. Another crop that was frequently talked about was cotton, and cotton is very commercial in this particular area. And because this soil hasn't been used very much, because the rains only come every few years, then it's incredibly fertile. Next slide, please. Similarly, the story around the fishing is not one of disaster, but one of abundance. Those shallow lakes last for up to 3 years, 4 years after the El Nino rains, until they start drying out. And they become places where mullet fish particularly, but also tilapia that get trapped from the sea, basically take hold here. and a vibrant fishing industry grows up. Now, this is really important because the El Nino and also climate change is affecting the waters in the sea, as we've already heard from the previous presentation. So some of the traditional sea fishing at an El Nino time particularly, and now under climate change, is under threat. So those sea fishers then turn to fish in the lagoon. And one of the, you can see here, they fish off traditional rafts, which they're adapting. Some are mixing wood and plastic, depending on how far they have to carry them. But this is a very traditional design of offshore, very sort of close to the shore fishing rafts that then they've reproduced for these lagoons. Next slide, please. And this has been an enormous industry in this area after the most recent El Nino, and it's only just on its sort of last legs this year. So that's several years since 2017. One of the lorry drivers we talked to explained that what they do is they transport the fishers and their rafts to the side of the lake. They leave them there for 3 days, and then they put the fish into boxes into the lorry that has all of the ice in it. And he said that his lorry takes 400 to 500 boxes, each of 20 kilos each. So that's 9,000 kilos in 3 days of fish coming from this Lagoon La Niña. It's then transported to the nearest city of Chiclayo, as well as to Lima. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the local town of Piura doesn't like buying the lisa, as it's called in Spanish, from the lagoon. They think it's dirty. They prefer the lisa from the sea. So these sort of cultural attitudes and geographies of stigma also affect what can be sold where. And our 76-year-old farmer talked about the fact that this livelihood at the time of El Nino is mutual. He says, so there's always something. Sometimes when there's a good harvest from the farm, that's when I buy tools to go fishing. And also when there's good fishing, we want things for them to farm. Next slide, please. So what we've been doing with our partners is we were originally going to go and do oral histories to capture this intangible heritage, and we were going to work with a local school and conduct the interviews ourselves. But of course, COVID hit. And what happened was the school and our NGO partner Prisma suggested that rather than forgetting the oral histories, we could use El Nino and as a way to engage with the government's program of digital learning and Aprender en Casa, learn at home. And what we developed was a digital curriculum around storytelling, which was hugely successful. It was piloted, some of the data quality wasn't that great, but in terms of what it meant for the community, you'll see in a minute in a video how the school was able to mobilize around it to try to use that heritage and the storytelling practices to help children to become communicators around how to deal with disasters. And so in the picture here, our local coordinator, Oliver Calle, is handing over computer tablets to the school. This was basically our travel budget, which changed into computer tablets. And so in the video that Francesca, the short video that Francesca is going to share with you now, what you will see is one of the teachers, Nancy, responding to a prize that she has won for that innovative digital curricula. It basically won a regional educational innovation prize and then a national one. And Nancy can explain how this works far better than I can. So this is a short 4-minute video of her responding to why this is important.
Las preguntas a la profesora Nancy Cana, que es responsable de esta buena experiencia. ¿Me podría responder qué te llevó a realizar este proyecto y cómo te ha impactado en tu vida personal y profesional Nancy, ¿nos podría responder?
Muy buenos días, estimados docentes, partícipes de este segundo encuentro internacional organizado por esta prestigiosa institución, FONDEP, del Ministerio de Educación. Sí, a mí lo que me motivó a iniciar este proyecto fue primero buscar, ¿cierto?, encontrar en mis estudiantes cuáles eran sus necesidades de aprendizaje, cuáles eran, ¿cierto?, esas necesidades que a mí me permitirían analizar esa problemática y plantear mi proyecto. Encontré así que una de las problemáticas era la deficiente expresión oral de mis estudiantes y lo vi con mucha claridad en las clases virtuales de Aprendo en Casa que se compartía mediante lo que es el WhatsApp. Así, por ejemplo, los estudiantes expresaban respuestas muy cortas, sí, no, de acuerdo, en desacuerdo. Mostraban cierta falta de coherencia, muchas veces en las ideas que les expresaban. Les era difícil explicar un tema, e incluso cuando tenían que llegar a la exposición del mismo, mostraban cierta timidez e inseguridad. Ante ello, entonces los docentes decidimos reunirnos y analizar esta problemática. Pero teníamos nosotros los docentes que crear algo innovador, algo cierto que llevara a motivar a los estudiantes para que desarrollen esta competencia de la expresión oral. Y así fue. Nuestra estrategia que implementamos fue la estrategia RECUS, que implica lo que es recrear, crear, ¿verdad?, estas historias recopiladas de los mismos sabios de su comunidad. Por supuesto que ante esta problemática vamos a encontrar también algunas dificultades, como era la implementación de nuestro proyecto. Pero gracias a nuestros aliados estratégicos, a esas instituciones que siempre nos apoyan, como es en Sechura, contamos con el apoyo del proyecto Educando Hoy para el Futuro, gestionado por FOSPIBAY. Asimismo también el proyecto Fenómeno de Oportunidades, financiado por la Universidad San Andrews, que nos permitieron a nosotros la implementación de este proyecto. Además de ello, se tenía que trabajar en un contexto real, porque los estudiantes, cuando tienen un contexto real, cuando trastocan su realidad, su localidad, los aprendizajes se hacen más significativos. Por ello, nuestra estrategia fue aplicar el storytelling. ¿Qué significaba ello? Que el estudiante aquí iba a plasmar su creatividad y su conexión con el público, porque ante un problema, ante una adversidad, siempre hay una oportunidad, y ellos lo encontraron gracias al fenómeno del niño. Esta estrategia del storytelling le va a permitir contar historias conteniendo como centro a un protagonista. ¿Y quiénes van a ser esos protagonistas? Los protagonistas van a ser los sabios de su comunidad, estos padres y abuelos que van a tener voz en este momento y le van a impartir conocimientos, aprendizajes. Eso fue lo que nos motivó a nosotros a llevar a la implementación de este proyecto. En mi vida personal, impactó de una manera muy positiva.
If we can just share the last two slides of the PowerPoint now, you'll see the passion with which Nancy spoke about that hugely successful program. And the lessons for us, next slide please, is that this program puts young people as actors, not just adults in the waiting, but actors now, communicators, and enables them to use the El Niño phenomenon to help their skills and be communicators in development around disasters. Now, this is crucially important because at the moment, most of the reconstruction in the north of Peru is focusing on large infrastructure projects. And part of this is being financed through a British partnership, as you can see here. There was an agreement signed earlier this year, and that is all large infrastructure projects in the Piura region. And the plan currently is to avoid flooding in the city of Piura and to take all of the flood water bypassing the desert and straight out to sea. And it's crucially important that the voices of people in the desert who have been managing this system and taking advantage of it in the context of disasters as well, that their voices are heard and that they also get to sit at that table. So just with the final slide, this, if we could go to the next slide, this is just these are all our partners, and this is our thank you to everybody. Our website is there at the bottom, but the logo in Spanish for the phenomenon of opportunities in English captures the elements: the sun, the fishing, and the green corn. So thank you, Angelica, and thank you everybody for your time today.
Really empowering project. Well, at the end, we will have some thoughts and closing remarks about all these inspirational presentations that we are looking right now. Now, we go to Lucia Llanes. She will present our second case. She is Bachelor in Management for Sustainable Local Development. She has worked for more than 17 years in cultural and artistic projects for education and cultural heritage safeguarding. Her interests and actions focus on theater production for social change, local development management, gender, and cultural heritage. Lucia is the current manager, cultural producer, and narrator of Quito Eterno, Eternal Quito Foundation, a non-profit organization with 19 years of experience. In alliance with Sabor y Patrimonio, Taste and Heritage, and Red de Guardianes de Semillas, Seeds Guardians Network, the platform Mishki Lab or Sweet Lab was created and managed, meant to carry out actions related to the preservation of food heritage in Ecuador. The platform offers various experiences to learn about seeds, protection, sovereignty, and food heritage. So welcome, Lucia.
Hoy quiero hablarles de mi pueblo, llevar la memoria a un tiempo lejano, muy cerquita del corazón del Churo, del Espiral. Nuestro pueblo vivía de la agricultura y del intercambio. Nos alimentábamos y vestíamos de lo que la tierra producía, en plantas y en animales. Lo que no producíamos llegaba de otras comunidades. La sal, las especias, las noticias de criaturas y dioses lejanos, de coloridos pájaros y de gigantes serpientes. El tiempo siempre volvía al mismo lugar, pero en un punto diferente del infinito. Nuestros antepasados aprendieron a escuchar las voces del viento y las señales de los astros. Así descubrimos cómo mejorar la agricultura y la cría de los animales. Vengo de un tiempo muy lejano, de una época en la que sacábamos a los muertos de abajo, que les poníamos sus mejores vestimentas, preparábamos sus comidas favoritas y con ellos nos acompañábamos y los sacábamos en andas para que estos ancestros recibieran las primeras gotitas de lluvia de los últimos meses y luego los volvíamos a guardar. Era el Ayamarcaiquiza, o mes de amarcar a los muertos, porque para nosotros la vida no era así, como una línea nomás, sino que llevaba un sentido de espiral, porque no todo terminaba. Uno no nacía, crecía y se moría. Eso es cosa de ahora, sino como un espiral, en donde se nace, se crece, se muere, pero se vuelve a nacer y únicamente hay un cambio de ciclo. Y entonces volvíamos a guardar a nuestros muertos, a nuestros ancestros, para luego sacarles otra vez. De un tiempo donde todo tenía sentido, de un tiempo donde estábamos completamente conectados con todo lo que había a nuestro alrededor, con las plantas, los árboles, con la montaña y el agua. De un tiempo cuando todo tenía sentido. Cuando un guagua cumplía 2 años, había que hacerle el rutu. ¿Han hecho rutu y ustedes? Entonces, ¿qué les hacen a los guaguas? A los niños o niñas dirán, cuando cumplen 2 años. Pues se les toma y se les lleva por toda la comunidad, porque verán que para nosotros uno no es nada, la comunidad lo es todo. Llevábamos al guagua casa por casa y ahí se tomaba el pelito del guagua y se le cortaba un mechoncito, una partecita, por cada casa. Y cada casa iba dando un regalo al guagua. ¿Y para qué hacíamos esto? Porque a esa edad el guagua entraba en entendimiento, así que había que despejarle toda la cabecita de su cabello para que quedara libre y para que todo el conocimiento que había alrededor pudiese entrar en él. Vengo de un tiempo donde las mujeres ellas mismas se iban al río y con todas las fuerzas de ellas, de las mamas y de las parteras, daban a luz ahí. Y con las hojas de los ixes, que son plantas que nacen a orillas del río, se sacaban. Con eso se cortaba esa parte, que era lo que unía la vida. Y se guardaba la placenta también, como un remedio ahí, abajito del fogón, para usarlo cuando fuera necesario. Vengo de un tiempo diferente, donde las montañas hablaban. Que donde estoy, en la tierra de la mitad, en Quito, que aquí es mitad y que todo es tierra y que no hay ningún lugar como este. Quito, que no es español y que tampoco es quichua, sino es una antigua lengua más viejísima y milenaria. Quito, que si uno lo ve desde arriba, está en medio de 4 montañas. En una que dicen que es, o era más bien para la adoración al sol, está de ese lado. Otra que está por allá, que ahora tiene el nombre de San Juan, que dicen era el lugar antiguo de la luna. De este lado estaba el templo del agua o Ichimbía. Y atrás, ahí grandísima e imponente, estaba el Pichincha, la gran huaca de Quito, la que todo lo decidía, la que todo sabía. Y la gente no vivía aquí en Quito, en la ciudad vieja, sino que estaba ahí, en varias comunidades, y venían acá, a los sitios sagrados, a las quebradas, lavaban sus manos, lavaban sus pies, y entraban a este espacio especial. ¿Quién soy? Me otorgaron el nombre de Quilago. Quilago. Que algunos dicen que más bien mi nombre es más de fantasía o de leyenda. Otros, en cambio, dicen que sí existí, que yo misma fui una mujer que lideró a un gran ejército de mujeres en las pirámides de Cochasquí. Para otros, en cambio, mis historias, mi espíritu, todavía está en las taitas, en los mamas, en viejas prácticas, pero también en antiguas recetas. Quilago. Quilago hoy les dicen a las mujeres que son muy fuertes y líderes. Quilago, su voz y su memoria, sigue habitando todos los lugares más sagrados de este lugar. ¿Y qué comíamos? Pues todo lo que había a nuestro alrededor. Papas, maíz, quinoa. ¿Y cómo preparábamos todo esto? Eso es lo que yo les voy a contar hoy. Porque en donde vivíamos, ahí poníamos a secar los maíces. Porque eso sí, para cada fiesta había una gran celebración. Se secaban los maíces, que luego se llamaban guayungas. Y esos maíces se ponían en grandes tiestos de barro. Porque la tierra, la Pachamama, era lo más importante. Y ahí se ponían estos maíces para que se secaran, para que se tostaran y para que aguantaran mucho tiempo. Porque la semilla tiernita, esa recién cosechada, era semilla viva. Y esa se debía guardar por unos 3 años y duraba bien. Pero la otra, la que se tostaba en este gran tiesto, esa podía durar hasta como 10 años. Y luego se tomaba esas semillas y se las ponía en la misma piedra. Habían dos piedras, la mamá Rumi y la guagua Rumi. La mamá Rumi era una piedra grande, grande, acompañada de la guagua que era más chiquita. Y ahí se molía. Se ponían estos maíces tostados. Y de moler eso salía la harina de maíz. Y eso ya era buen potaje para nosotros, porque en esa harina se tomaba, se le ponía un poquito de agua y eso formaba la mashka. Y esta mashka era un buen potaje, porque lo que más comíamos hace más de 500 años era sopas de legumbres. Y a estas buenas sopas se ponía esta mashka, esta harina espesa, y esto se convertía en un gran alimento para las fiestas, pero también para aguantar las grandes jornadas porque había que trabajar bastante. Para cada fiesta una comida y para cada comida una celebración. Caras, caras, puriquingue, caras, puriquingue. Así pues, zapateando fuerte, zapateando para que la tierra se despierte, porque recuerden que todo está vivo. Y entonces celebrábamos con una buena chicha, hecha de ese maíz. Chicha que nos ayudaba a conectarnos. Chicha que le dábamos a la tierra. Chicha que la tomábamos nosotros. Chicha que también nos permitía conectarnos con los dioses y con los ancestros. Y todo tenía un sentido. Y todo tenía una explicación. Porque nosotros no hacíamos las cosas así nomás. ¿Quieren ustedes comer comida antigua? Es fácil. Venga. Claro que las comidas han cambiado. Y su forma de preparación también. Porque luego llegaron otros ingredientes desde muy lejos. Y los maíces, las papas, la quinoa, el maní, el ají, que era la base de nuestras comidas, se mezcló con otras cosas que llegaron desde lejos, con el ajo, con la cebolla, con la leche, con los quesos y otras cosas que eran desconocidas para los antiguos habitantes de aquí. Y así todo se fue transformando. Pero si uno escarba un poco, si uno busca un poco, se da cuenta que no solo era aquí que se comía queso, sino que eso se comía en todas partes. Y qué mejor que comer el maíz. Alimento sagrado, alimento que da fuerza, alimento que provoca la fiesta, porque también nosotros hacíamos pachamanca. ¿Han comido pachamanca? Fácil es. En la tierra, en la chacra, en un pedazo de tierra, se hace un hueco y en ese hueco se ponen piedras bien calientes, así casi rojas, y ahí se ponen los choclos con sus cáscaras que se llaman cutules, las legumbres con sus vainas, las frutas también con sus cáscaras, y el calorcito de las piedras se mezcla con los jugos de todos estos productos. Y eso se vuelve el mejor alimento. Eso se combina con chicha, y eso se da en las grandes fiestas de las cosechas, porque la cosecha y la siembra eran lo más importante para nosotros. Marcaba nuestra vida. El sol y la luna marcaban esos ciclos agrícolas. Pero yo sé que ustedes quieren preparar algo más conmigo. Han comido humitas. Humitas, las que son de maíz. Que yo les voy a enseñar aquí a hacer humitas. Es bien fácil. Pues se necesita primero los choclos. Los choclos que no necesariamente tienen que estar así, muy tiernitos como guagua. Pueden estar un poquito más maduros. ¿Ven el choclo? Pues el choclo se le va desgranando. Pero ¿saben qué pasaba antes? Antiguamente, mientras iba cocinando, también se iban compartiendo historias. Y ahí, las abuelas, mientras iban desgranando, iban contándonos de los amores de las montañas. Acá hay muchas cosas de eso. Porque aquí, montañas, en los Andes es lo que más hay, pues. Yo digo que solo por aquí las montañas se enamoran. Y nos hablaban del Imbabura, que era montaña vieja, montaña anciana, pero que tenía su corazoncito. Esta montaña estaba enamorada de María Nieves Cotacachi, que era una montaña más jovencita y coqueta. Pero había otra montaña que también le pretendía. Era el Mojanda. Cuentan las historias de los más viejos, que los espíritus de la montaña hicieron un duelo y se pelearon por los amores de la Cotacachi. ¿Ustedes qué creen? ¿Quién ganó aquel duelo? ¿La montaña más vieja o la montaña más joven? Y así se seguía desgranando y se seguía contando. Pues la montaña más jovencita fue la que se quedó con la Cotacachi, el Mojanda. Dicen que el Imbabura estaba tan molesto de haberse quedado solo que inmediatamente comenzó a escupir un montón de piedras, de lava y de fuego y causó un desastre por allá en las tierras del norte. Y así se iba desgranando. Pero luego que se desgranaba entonces, y ya que estaba así el maicito, había que molerlo. Este es maíz tierno que les decía, el que está vivo. Y acá está el maíz más seco. Esto es la mama rumi y esta es la guagua rumi. Mama y guagua siempre están juntas. Y así, cuando se tostaba esto y cuando se molía, con eso se hacían las harinas y las chichas. Pero después de moler este maíz, tiernito, tiernito, más o menos así es como queda la mezcla. Ustedes que ya viven en tiempos tan modernos hoy, seguramente no tendrán la suerte de tener una piedra grande y una piedra chiquita, así que pueden usar lo que deseen. Y ya que hacen esta mezcla, en estos tiempos modernos, le ponen sal, dulce. Antiguamente no le poníamos nada, solo estaba ahí la mezcla del maíz. Como les dije, todo cambió, todo se volvió más mestizo. Así que a esta mezcla se le ponía un poco de esos nuevos ingredientes. Cebolla, un poquito de queso, y algunos en estos tiempos le ponen hasta manteca de chancho para que se haga suavita, dicen. Antiguamente nada de eso se ponía. Se tenía solo la mezcla y se cogían las cáscaras del mismo maíz. Y en estas cáscaras del maíz, que se llama cutul, se ponía la mezcla. Sí es bien fácil hacer comida antigua. Pero esto me recuerda algo. Me recuerda otra historia de nosotros. Así que si ustedes hacen esto, la van a recordar también. Estos por aquí son envueltos. Y aquí en estos lugares también se envuelven a los guaguas, a los niños y niñas, a los bebés, dirán ustedes. Y al niño se le envuelve desde abajo, desde los piecitos. Se le envuelve con algo y se le va ajustando. ¿Para qué? La creencia dice que es para que se haga más fuertecito, para que sus huesos crezcan fuertes. Y entonces se le envuelve bien y se cierra la humita. Se envuelve bien al guagua y con una parte de la misma cáscara se cierra la humita. Y ya cerrada, lo que se hacía antiguamente Era ponerle a la brasa hasta que se cocine lo que estaba dentro. Hoy en tiempos modernos, se le cocina con un poquito de vapor. Y ahí se deja la humita. En tiempos de ustedes modernos dicen que 20 minutos. Nosotros teníamos buen ojo y buen tacto, así que estábamos tanteando para ver en qué momento estaba lista, en qué momento salía. Y como ahora estamos en tiempos modernos y a mí también me toca hacer eso, pues por acá ya está una humita, calientita. Y aquí está el envuelto. El maíz está cocido. Ahora en estos tiempos modernos se hace humitas de dulce y de sal, dicen los antiguos. Pero así como se envolvía a la humita, que eran así como se envolvían a los guaguas, ya envuelto el guagua, se le ponía en las espaldas. Mucha gente no entiende por qué las mujeres van a trabajar, a hacer los quehaceres con los guaguas en las espaldas. ¿Por qué? ¿Por qué se hacía esto? Porque ya envuelto el guagua como humita, como tamalito, se le ponía ahí atrás. Y de alguna manera, la madre podía sentir los latidos de corazón del guagua y sabíamos que estaban vivos. Y así, madre y guagua iban juntos. Las comidas, claro, han ido cambiando. Ahora también, no solo que se hacen humitas, sino que también se hacen quimbolitos, chihuiles, tamales con la harina del maíz seco. Ahora se les pone carne, cebolla y otras cosas más. Pero al final la esencia de estas viejas comidas, de estas viejas formas de cocinar, sigue siendo la misma. Es así como esto y otras historias cruzan las edades para contarnos del valor y las memorias de los más viejos, para recordarnos por siempre que es mejor sostener la dignidad en lo alto, erguidos, de frente al sol, como el cóndor lo hace cuando mira la cima de las montañas. Buen día, buenos días con todos y todas. Mi nombre es Lucía, soy parte de la Fundación Quito Eterno y esta es la forma en cómo nosotros hablamos de las comidas, de la memoria, de la identidad. Trabajamos con grupos de estudiantes todas las mañanas, todo el tiempo, y en las noches con grupos de familias y amigos que quieren conocer más de su historia. Así que esto es lo que hacemos: narrar, contar historias, interpretar a personajes, investigar muchísimo, vivirlo primero nosotros y luego con esa sensibilidad contarle a la gente sobre lo que es y sobre su historia. Muchas gracias por habernos permitido demostrar cuál es el trabajo de Quito Eterno. Nuestra principal actividad son rutas de leyenda, así que hacemos recorridos teatralizados por aquí, caminando por el centro histórico, y como vieron, una forma de hacer el mixquilab. Mixqui es dulce, lab de laboratorio, este es el laboratorio de lo sabroso, en donde revisamos comidas antiguas, recetas de tiempos pasados, otras formas de cocción, analizamos cuáles eran los productos que podíamos obtener antes, cuáles son los nuevos, cuáles son las nuevas texturas, los nuevos sabores, y a partir de un encuentro en la cocina, cocinamos con la gente, probamos esos sabores, intercambiamos historias, recetas, y nos aproximamos a que de alguna manera esas viejas recetas, esas antiguas formas no se pierdan completamente, y que también nos cuenten quiénes somos, de dónde venimos y cómo podemos asegurar todo este patrimonio alimentario también desde nuestras prácticas cotidianas. Muchas gracias.
Well, really emotive. Thank you very much, Lucia and Quito Eterno, for this in live theatrical, and beautiful story. Well, right now, finally, we have Dr. Philippa Ryan with a wonderful presentation about Nubian traditional knowledge and agricultural resilience, crop choices, and endangered cultural heritage. Philippa Ryan is a research fellow at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, London. He is an ethnobotanist and archaeobotanist whose research focuses in traditional agricultural and food systems, orphan food crops, and their recent and long-term histories. So welcome, Philippa.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And brilliant. Is that working properly?
Yes.
All good. Okay, thank you. So agriculture has been rapidly changing in northern Sudan over the last 50 years especially, for many reasons, but including the shift from the traditional water wheel, the sagia, which is a really important part of sort of agricultural cultural heritage, to using diesel pumps along the Nile between the 1950s and 70s. And then alongside that, the introduction of lots of new crop varieties, and more recently, the completion of the Merowe Dam in 2009 greatly reduced the annual flood that was a key time in the calendar before that. And so in this research, we were interviewing farmers in sort of household farms in Nubian villages about the crops they grow today, how they grow them and their uses, and the changes in living memories. So we had a real focus on trying to talk to elderly farmers about changes in their lifetime. And the research was focused in the north of the country, in the Sukut region of Nubia, and especially on an island called Aneta in the neighbouring town of Abri. So there's a really wide range of different cereals and pulse crops grown there, and I'm only showing one graph, but it was just to show that there's a great change in the range of crops that farmers are growing from the mid-20th century to the present day. And that was particularly clear in the case of cereals, with far fewer farmers growing them today on their farms. And just to highlight what I've mentioned there in like dashed lines about wheat, what was really interesting about the bread wheat species was that farmers only started growing it in these local villages around the 1950s, when they recalled a lady bringing them the wheat grains to the island, and then it rapidly started to replace whole barley that had been the key winter crop before that. And but then in recent years, bird attacks have become an increasing problem with the wheat crops. Actually, the farmers said it was because they were growing so many different varieties, they were harvesting at different times, and then the birds were predating them. And then in the local villages, they stopped growing wheat entirely from sort of about 2015 onwards. And the changes with the pulse crops have been similar. It's less clear on the graph, but basically people are still growing a wide diversity of pulses. But instead of growing the old traditional ones, lab and cowpea, in wide areas, they're growing most of these in very small patches and large areas of broad beans instead. So these are the range of crops that were sort of major food crops and fodder crops in the middle of the 20th century, but they've switched from being the major subsistence crops to minor food crops today. And then this shows all of these different crops growing in small patches along the riverbank, which kind of illustrates that point that they're still being grown, but in very small areas. And in this case, these riverbank areas are almost acting like home gardens, and these are all being grown in small quantities for household use. But actually, these riverbank areas are incredibly productive, amazing soils, and so the river's still high for a few months in the summer, but only covering these lower lying sloping areas. So they can grow these crops immediately after that without needing any extra irrigation, but then they can keep planting them again after that all the way through to the next summer, because these very locally sort of long grown adapted varieties of these crops have got root systems that can reach the water table. So it's a small area but highly productive. So all of these older crops share several really resilient characteristics. They're all very fast growing and heat tolerant, and but they've all got different reasons why they've stopped being grown so much, and the timing of this is slightly different for each crop. So whole barley was the major winter food cereal, but one of the problems with it is that it can be slow to process because the grains are tightly encased in this lemma and palea chaff, which so I've shown a picture on the top right because otherwise it's hard to imagine. But basically farmers explained that after grinding it to flour, they'd have to try and sieve this chaff out up to 8 times. However, barley is a lot faster growing than the wheat and a lot more low input, and this chaff, although annoying, did help protect it against the bird attacks. But now it's an almost disappeared food crop. There's just tiny patches of it being grown, more as a fodder crop and occasionally to make a drink. And some villages have stopped growing it altogether. And similarly with the sorghum, but this was grown more up to around the 2000s as for food still, but then like more recently with wheat, the bird attacks became a problem as people grew it less and less. The people that did try to grow it for food then suffered the birds coming to eat the grains. So now it's still grown less than before, but just as a fodder crop, and the grains and flours being bought instead. And another problem was that once people switched to the diesel pumps, then you had these new costs of paying for diesel, and so suddenly sorghum became more expensive to grow than the rain-fed that came from other parts of the country. So lab is my favourite pulse crop, and it was, according to the elderly farmers, the most important food pulse crop in the mid-20th century, and also a very important fodder crop. And this particular pulse is particularly arid tolerant and can be grown at any time of year. It's another fast growing one. It can grow to 3 to 4 months, and people would literally just sow it again and again through the year. But now it's an almost forgotten food crop and also a relatively minor fodder crop as well. Lupin is another example of a pulse crop that's grown a little bit less today, and in this case is particularly useful for being grown in very marginal spots, like in the picture at the front. You can see it growing on this very sandy soils, but it requires quite a lengthy detoxification. So in contrast to these old crops that used to be grown in extensive areas and are now in small patches, broad beans and bread wheat that were previously minor crops because they were quite hard to grow before the diesel pumps have instead become the major crops grown in extensive areas, except to say that the wheat has now stopped being grown altogether in local villages because of the birds. So these crops, the advantages were they're higher value because they're more commercial, and they've become the key crops in the modern food culture. But they have the disadvantage of only being able to grow in the winter months, so they're at risk of climate change because they are really dependent on the cooler months, which are only sort of December and January, and they require more intensive irrigation than any of the other cereals and pulses. So these changes to the crops are paralleled in changing changes to the food dishes as well. So in the mid-20th century, flatbreads and various types of porridge-like dishes were the most common dishes, and made from all the different cereal flours as well as pulse flours, especially lupin and cowpea. And people ate a very wide variety of different boiled pulses. And these are all still eaten today, but less frequently. And crucially, with the flatbreads and porridges, fewer cereals are used than in the past. So it's and no pulse flours anymore. So it's like a hidden shift in nutrition as well. And I'm trying to get the. No, it's moving. Then increasingly over time, baked wheat bread became more predominant, which is eaten with casseroled broad beans called full. Taking a deep time perspective, the early phases of the project involved comparing the recent and ancient crop choices, and all of the crops that have become minor crops recently, but with the major crops in the mid-20th century, were also really important crops in the archaeological past. So whole barley has the longest history, being an important crop regionally for 7,000 years up until the 1960s. Sorghum was the key cereal crop, summer crop, for the last 2,000 years until around the 1980s and 90s, sort of between the 1980s and 2000s. And lab and cowpea were key pulse crops for the last 2,000 years up until around the 1960s, 70s. So this, having this sort of deep time perspective helps emphasize the long-term resilience of these crops and potential environmental suitability compared to the current winter cash crops. And this big shift in growing crops throughout the year, and now being instead focused particularly on the winter months, is really evident in these two Google Earth images, where the one on the top shows the cultivation in the winter months in February, and you can see how much the island is green. And then in contrast, in July, there's little patches being cultivated, so people are still growing those crops that can be grown in the hotter months, but just in really small areas. And the elderly farmers said that previously they cultivated all of the island all year. And that was a pattern that had been established for the prior 2,000 years as a sort of risk management strategy. So a key output of the project was then to co-produce a community-orientated book with the aim of trying to preserve some of this sort of local information from the oral histories. So in general, throughout the country, and I would say this is of broader relevance to many parts of the world, these sorts of local crop histories about these less commercial sort of local crops are little documented, but this information is in the memories of elderly farmers, but it's very endangered now, considering the length of time since some of these sort of major changes started to happen in the mid-20th century. And this sort of local knowledge about the crops and the cultivation practices through to the food processing is on one hand endangered cultural heritage, and additionally also sort of practical knowledge relevant to future agricultural resilience about how to grow these crops and keep them and process them. And then I've just got a few pictures here from the local book. So on one hand, it tried to go through the different crops with some of the different information about how they were used in the past and today. And then also to try and illustrate some of the processing methods. So from harvesting through to cooking. So some sort of traditional practices like harvesting by hand still persist, and then other practices like threshing stopped about 20 years ago. And similarly with sort of grinding cereals, now people use mills or buy bread in the market, but you can still sort of be shown how to use the older techniques. And then we also have like a section on the local archaeology and archaeobotany. And a big focus as well was inventorying all of the crops and foods and agricultural terms in the local Nubian dialect, as well as Arabic. So overall, combining like recent and the ancient crop histories can help provide that deep time perspective to see the longer term histories of local crops and which ones have been the important ones over the long term. And these different indigenous and traditional food crops that have these long histories have the high potential as naturally climate smart crops, but especially when understood within the context of how they're grown locally and used. But this local historic crop diversity and associated knowledge are now very endangered. So, thank you very much. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you very, very much, Filipa, for your presentation. Thank you also, Nina and Lucia. The experiences you have told us today demonstrate that climate change affects everyone unevenly, and both culture and heritage help us to understand the nuances of inequalities in food and agricultural fields. Culture is a source of cohesion. We just saw the importance of including younger generations that anchors people to territories and connects people to each other. It is the foundation of communities and collective action. Cultural heritage contains the stories and knowledge of local communities. Thus, it helps us to remember how our ancestors have faced past changes, contributes to attenuate the want of social and economic pressures, help us to understand what makes us human, as well as to realize everything we can lose if we don't act now. In general terms, the projects we have listened today show us that the traditional agricultural knowledge and artisanal expertise from all over the world can help us to ensure sustainable food production, decarbonize the production of food, reduce chemical pesticides, save water, and encourage animal well-being. To combine circular economy models with traditional systems of land, water, agriculture, and forest management supports fisheries, agriculture, and rural sustainable development. Therefore, these and other beneficial agricultural practices of heritage should be properly incorporated into ecological systems, objectives, and national strategic plans worldwide. Incorporating traditions and cultural preferences of the different communities and human groups in the world, as well as the benefits of traditional diets in people's health, would enhance the cultural identity and continuity of local communities. From public policy formulation, it is necessary to support farmers, fishermen, and aquaculture producers to transform agricultural production methods by reintroducing and employing traditional agriculture knowledge and artisanal production know-how. Existing models of landscape conservation and governance can be used to encourage circular territorial metabolisms in historic rural landscapes through synergies between territorial actors for the efficient use of water, energy, waste, and material. It is also vital to guarantee the protection of cultural heritage and the related collateral benefits with it, has the identity, cohesion, and creativity for the construction of safe and sustainable food systems for people, earth, and climate. The experiences that we have been able to know during the development of this session make us realize the importance of expanding exciting programs designed to identify the safeguard agricultural heritage systems and their associated landscapes, biodiversity and knowledge as part of the initiatives to preserve and restore the land, fresh water, and marine resources on which the food systems depend. To achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, it is fundamental to give greater relevance to the cultural and heritage dimension in order to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is imperative to generate changes in consumption patterns and behavior that take place in broader contexts. Also, actions related to cultural relevance are more complex to achieve. Once achieved, they help to guarantee resilient community-led processes and are more likely to be accepted by a greater number of people, as well as to last over time. We are just on time, so thank you very much for being part of this session. Special thanks to Francesca, Esther, Belén, our translator, Magus, Gina, Mercedes, they are in backstage. Again, thanks to the Climate Heritage Network, Andrew, PRAXIS, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council for helping us to this happen. Let's include more and more culture pertinence in our efforts on having a more resilient society. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.